BEP committee members and guests. This is our first meeting, obviously, of the year. We have quite a bit to cover in the amount of time that's been allocated, but I do want to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. I do want to start out by welcoming a new member to the committee that is able to join us today, albeit he is on vacation and joining us from Alaska, and that is Mr. Bob Eby, who represents the 3rd Congressional District and serves on the State Board of Education. So Bob was appointed to this committee at the May quarterly meeting of the State Board of Education. So as I said, he's on vacation and he will not be able to the entire time.
Okay.
If everyone could mute their phones until we do the roll call, that would be wonderful.
Oh, sorry.
May.
Lillian, what was that?
I asked Bob, first of all, I was welcoming Bob. I hope everyone heard that. Welcoming Bob Eby as our newest member to the BEP Review Committee. Did you all hear that, or do I have to repeat that?
I heard the Bob introduction.
Okay. Bob, can you hear us? Bob Eby?
I'm here, yes.
Welcome to the committee. Bob, do you want to say anything? I know you're on vacation, and you probably had that vacation state of mind.
Well, first, I'm honored to be a member of this. I did serve on the local Board of Education in Oak Ridge for 16 years, so I know a little bit about the BEP and look forward to doing this. And yes, we're getting ready to get on a train to Talkeetna, Alaska. So I will be here and be online at least for half an hour and as long as I can. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your willingness to join us, especially while you're traveling on vacation. So let's go ahead and get into the agenda. I do want to just say a few remarks before we get into the full agenda, and we'll certainly have Nathan do the roll call for us in just a moment. But I do want to remind everyone that the work of the committee is establishing priorities, and that focusing our efforts has brought about many successes the last several years, as many of you know who have served on this committee for a number of years. This year there were lots of successes, and we will hear about them later in the meeting. So our first order of business is to call the roll to establish a quorum, and as always, I call on Nathan James to do that for us.
Thank you, ma'am. Michelle Simcox?
Here.
Representative White or Patrick Boggs?
Patrick Boggs here for Representative Mark White.
Thank you, sir. David Connor? David Connor? Senator Gresham or Michael Merrill? So Michael's having trouble getting in, but I know he's on.
Nathan, I'm on.
Okay, great. Ben Torres? With us this morning, Counselor? Yeah, he's expected to join. Eddie Pruitt is doing principal professional development this morning, so he's not able to be here. Chris Henson?
Here.
Sarah Morrison?
Here.
Karen King?
Here.
Commissioner Schwinn?
Mary Ann Dursky for Commissioner Schwinn.
Great. Commissioner McWhorter?
Greg Turner for Commissioner McWhorter.
Thanks, Greg. We appreciate it. Cliff Lippard?
Here.
Larry Ridings?
Here.
Bob Eby?
Here.
With us, Mickey Hall? Justin Wilson or Linda Wesson? Is Linda with us yet? Hunter Zanardi? Dale Lynch?
Here.
Mayor McDonald?
Here.
For the either Catherine Hare or Peter Mueller? Anyone in the Legislative Budget Office? And Bobby Cox?
Here, I'm on the call.
Very good. And Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Nathan. We have.
Hi, Nathan. This is
Sorry,
Go ahead.
Madam Chair. It's Ben
No, that's
Torres. I'm Ben Torres. I'm able to join.
Hey, great. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you,
Yes,
Ben.
sir.
We have a quorum and we are duly convened. Without objection, the recording of the last meeting of the committee will serve as the minutes for that meeting. Without objection, so ordered. Let's move into the agenda, overview of the education budget legislative highlights. At this time, I recognize Elizabeth Fiveash with the Tennessee Department of Education to give us the highlights and an overview of the executive budget as it relates to education. Ms. Fiveash, you are recognized, so please state your title for the record and proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Elizabeth Fiveash, and I am the Assistant Commissioner for Policy and Legislation with the Department of Education. Hopefully you all are able to see the slides. If not, let us know and we'll try to correct that.
The other thing, Elizabeth, too, before you go further, for if there are any technical difficulties, Nathan did email everyone a copy of this presentation as well as the one to follow. So check your email from Nathan as well. Thank you.
Okay, we will start with the 2019-2020 budget increases. The first is $71 million in additional funding to the instructional salary component of the BEP. This is funding that will be used for teacher raises, hiring additional teachers, bonuses, anything related to salaries. The second is $30 million in additional funding for school safety. This brings the total funding for school safety to $20 million recurring funding and $20 million in non-recurring funding. Some of this funding has been reserved to specifically provide school resource officers in districts that did not have a SRO in every school last school year.
And Elizabeth, I would mention to the committee that both the $71 million and the $30 million that she just mentioned were both in your top 5 priorities from last year. So that is something that this committee had pushed for. I think that we need to recognize that's a big step in the right direction.
Yes. $12 million in non-recurring funds to support charter school facilities. This is the third year of non-recurring funding that has been provided to support charter school facilities to help with some of their needs that they're not able to go to specifically to a funding body to secure. $1.8 million for the ACT retake opportunity. We've seen a huge increase in the number of students participating in this opportunity. It has helped increase our ACT scores all across the state and has really had a great return on investment in terms of Hope Scholarship dollars that students are able to access and fewer remedial courses having to be taken once in post-secondary. $2.4 million for the expansion of early post-secondary courses and dual credit courses. So again, this is to help support districts in whatever EPSO direction that they feel best meets the needs of their district, which is connected to our Ready Graduate Indicator in our accountability model. $750,000 for middle school CTE startup grants. Some of the funds focus specifically on STEM CTE courses. Again, the governor has expressed strong support for the career and technical education and ensuring that students are exposed to opportunities in industry very early in their schooling career. $5 million in non-recurring funds to support improvement in the state's priority schools. Again, this is the third year of non-recurring funds that have been provided to support priority schools. $1.1 million for STEM expansion across the state. So this includes funding for computer science course expansion, standards training, professional development, and technical assistance to schools seeking the STEM designation. And then lastly, $25 million in recurring funding for the Education Savings Account program. This funding will be available to districts that have students enrolling in the ESA program beginning in the 2021-22 school year. The first 3 years of the funding will be a reimbursement for students enrolling in the ESA program. After the first 3 years, it will be a priority school grant that will be available to any district that has a priority school. And Nathan, I will turn it over to you for slides 5 and 6.
Absolutely. So I wanted to include these two slides for everyone so that you could see a reasonably accurate breakdown of how the state spends the state dollars and the federal dollars, just so that we understand sort of the enormity of importance that is placed on education. You look at the federal side, and of course you have health and social services with eating up 78% of the budget, and the federal government providing 9% of our total education budget. But when we look at state dollars, you see that every 40 cents on the dollar that the state spends is on education there. Sometimes it's difficult for us to think, about how much of a priority that the state does put on education. It is the single largest expenditure in terms of state dollars that we have. And so advancing to the next slide, also when I found this put out by the Sycamore Institute, so many conversations that we've had on this committee came to mind. As you know, a few years ago, we started going through the priority process earlier so that we could get our priorities in front of the commissioners of finance and administration, education, and to the governor himself early enough to be included in their planning and estimation process as well as their budget preparation. So if you look at that, you see that come July 1, our departments in Tennessee are planning and estimating what their budget should look like, and then F&A begins the preparation process beginning in October. Obviously, for what we've done before, where we would just get the report out on 1 November, why you've already had the vast majority of the budget preparation was done by that point in time. So I just wanted to bring this slide out so that each of you could see the reason why we take the priorities in July and August time.
Thanks, Nathan. So now I'll move into the legislative highlights from this past session. The first few slides are covering the governor's initiatives. The first is Public Chapter 108, which requires LEAs to administer a career aptitude assessment to students in grades 7 or 8 to help inform a student's high school studies. This was an attempt to help students early on identify not only careers that they have an interest in, but careers that they have an aptitude for. Research has been conducted that shows students that participate in career aptitude assessment, it identifies more girls and students of color for careers in the math and science related fields, and so we want to ensure that this is another resource that all students have access to. Public Chapter 153. This requires LEAs to report to the department how any increases that they receive in the instructional component of the BEP is spent. It then requires the department to provide that information to the BEP Review Committee to be included in its annual report. I think that this is an attempt to collect solid data around how the increase in funding is spent. I think that probably we all have heard over the years that teachers have expressed that they're not seeing any increase in their salaries, and so we want to really get a sense of how these funds are actually being spent once they are pushed down to the district.
So,
Yes.
Elizabeth,
Could I ask a question, please?
yes.
This is Mayor McDonald. On Chapter 108, when is that to go into effect?
It will go into effect for next school year. The department will be providing a list of available aptitude assessments that districts can use within the coming weeks.
So that's the 1920 school year.
That's correct.
Thank you.
And Elizabeth, this is Lillian. I was going to ask a similar question to Public Chapter 153. What is the timing on that one?
That will begin with the funding that districts receive for FY20.
Okay. Thank
So we will collect that information most likely at the end of the next fiscal year.
Thank you.
Also, that once that information is in, we'll make sure that that's in the report in November, and so that everybody will see that, and we'll of course vote on that when we go through the editing process for the BEP.
But Nathan, that will not be for this year based on what Elizabeth said.
Oh,
that
I'm
will
sorry.
be for the
You're
following.
right.
For the following.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Public Chapter 203 establishes the Governor's Investment in Vocational Education Act. This will help provide additional opportunities for students participating in CTE dual enrollment courses. Public Chapter, I'm sorry,
Elizabeth, it's Lillian. So again, with 203, we're not far enough down the road with that one to have, or do you have timing yet? Because I think there's still more work to do. Correct?
That's correct, and we're in conversations with higher education right now to coordinate on timing for that one.
Okay, thank you.
Public Chapter 219, this establishes the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission that will serve as an independent appellate authorizer for charter schools. And this will transfer the appellate authorizing duties from the State Board of Education to the Commission. The State Board will continue as the appellate authorizer until the 2020 school year, when the Commission will then begin hearing appeals. Public Chapter 330, this establishes the Governor's Civic Seal to recognize public schools and LEAs implementing high-quality civic education programs. The State Board will be setting the guidelines that schools and districts will have to meet in order to earn the seal. Public Chapter 361, this creates the Agriculture Education and Youth Participation Task Force, which will be tasked with analyzing and making recommendations related to agriculture education in Tennessee, emerging technologies, and integrating ag career readiness goals into our Tennessee Pathways Initiative. Public Chapter 506, this establishes the Education Savings Account Program, such that eligible students may receive BEP funds to use for the educational services of their choice. This is applicable only to Shelby County schools and Metro Nashville Public Schools, and enrollment is set to begin in the 21-22 school year. So that covers the governor's initiatives. The next slides will just cover a few other legislative highlights. Public Chapter 4, yes.
My apologies. It's Dale. It also covers the Achievement School District too, correct?
That is correct. I should say students that are reside in Shelby County School District or the Metro Nashville School District.
Right. Thank you.
Public Chapter 442. This requires students to take and pass a U.S. civics test in order to meet the social studies course credit requirements to earn a traditional high school diploma. Public Chapter 468 removes the current requirement that LEAs that coordinate work-based learning maintain liability insurance, and instead requires LEAs to maintain student accident insurance coverage. The liability insurance coverage requirement was created through legislation that passed last year. After the passage of that legislation, several districts expressed concern and difficulty in actually acquiring liability insurance, and so we wanted to make sure that the requirement actually aligned with what their insurance coverage was. Public Chapter 475, this will require the TCAP test administered in the 2019-2020 school year to be administered in paper format, and it will require all LEAs to participate in an online verification exam prior to moving to online administration. Public Chapter 482, this changes from 1 to 2 the number of additional dual enrollment courses a student may take for a total of 3 dual enrollment courses per semester, and it caps the total number of courses for which a student may receive a dual enrollment grant at 10. So I think looking through some of these highlights, it's clear that the focus this year was really on ensuring early post-secondary and industry opportunities for students. That certainly was the governor's main priority coming into the legislative session, and legislators certainly joined him in that focus.
And Elizabeth, I believe part of that is about equitable access for all students.
That's correct? Exactly right.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Are there other questions or comments for Elizabeth before we move on to the next agenda item? Elizabeth, thank you very much. Appreciate you enlightening us on all that took place this past legislative year. Next is the review of the BEP components. And I just want to start out by saying TCA 49-3-102 gives the charge to this committee to regularly review the BEP components. At our first meeting of the year, it's important to set the foundation of our work through such a review. And so at this time, I do call on Mary Ann Dursky with the Department of Education to provide a review of the BEP components. Ms. Dursky, please state your title for the record and proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I just wanted to let you know I'm on the call, Dolores Gresham.
Thank you so much, Senator Gresham. We're pleased you can join us.
Good morning. This is Mary Ann Dursky. I'm the Executive Director of Local Finance with the Department of Education. We're going to briefly review the components in the BEP formula this morning. I'll start by reminding the committee that the components are those items that generate funding for districts through the formula. But the formula is very much a funding formula and not a spending plan, as we have often said. So that school districts, once they receive their funding, have a fair amount of discretion as to how these funds are used. There are 47 components funded in the basic education or BEP formula. The original components were established by the State Board of Education for the 1992-93 school year. Changes to the components are made via the approval of the State Board of Education, the Commissioner of Education, Commissioner of Finance and Administration, and the General Assembly. The most recent change that I believe most of us are familiar with was the addition in 2018 of the RTI positions to the formula. So in the instructional component or section of the BEP formula, we have primarily the professional positions that we find in our school districts. These are licensed positions. They include teachers, regular education, career and technical, special education teachers, counselors, music, art, physical education teachers, librarians, English language learner instructors, and English language learner translators. There are also the administrative instructional positions, principals, assistant principals, supervisors, assessment personnel, social workers, psychologists, and RTI personnel. All of those are in the instructional component. All of those are licensed. And funds that are generated in that component, that instructional component, must be used in the instructional component. The next section is the classroom component, and that's where we find the other things that we associate with classrooms in schools that are not licensed personnel. And so we find our K-12 at-risk students. Additional funding is provided for these students based on direct certification. There is funding for duty-free lunch so that teachers may have a lunch period free from the responsibility of supervising students. There's also funding for textbooks. There are separate unit costs for regular special education and CTE, materials and supplies, equipment, and classroom-related travel, which includes professional development. So depending on the category of costs, they have different unit values, depending on whether or not they're regular, special ed, or CTE. The classroom component also contains funding for post-secondary readiness exams and CTE-related exams, such as ACT. There is funding for generated by Career and Technical Center Transportation. This is for districts who, during the school day, transport some of their students to another school or to a CTE center for specific CTE instruction. The formula does generate funding based on that midday transportation. Technology funding is in the classroom component, as are positions for nurses, instructional assistants, special education assistants, library assistants, substitute teachers, and finally funding for alternative schools. The last major component is the non-classroom, and that is really more of your operational section. The director of schools is funding for that position is located here, system or district level secretaries, technology coordinators, school secretaries, and then your maintenance and operation and transportation functions, along with non-instructional equipment, custodians, and capital outlay. So that is, those are all the components in the non-classroom. It's important to recognize, too, that every position that is generated by the formula carries with it allocations for benefits, and those benefits are Social Security, Medicare, state retirement, and health insurance. So every position, regardless of whether or not the actual employees participate in health insurance or retirement, every one of those positions generates funding for those things. And that is a brief overview of all of the components that generate funding for our districts. This year.
Marianne?
Yes.
This is Keith McDonald again. I'd just like, I guess, to go on record for those who might not have listened in or heard from Tasser. We had a great deal of testimony and discussion about the BEP formula and funding. And I just want us as a BEP committee to continue to recognize basically BEP is broken, but all of us, I think, are afraid to fix it unless there's additional funding, because otherwise there'll be big winners and big losers. So that, I think, as we look, Nathan, to this year's work, we ought to be recognizing that and making that a part of our work. Thank you.
Karen King. Mine, just reviewing for those who might not know what the allocation is of instructional salaries and classroom funding and non-classroom funding. The 70-30.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Karen, for the clarification. Yes, on average, the state will fund 70% of the instructional category, and the local school districts or funding bodies are responsible for the remaining 30%. In the classroom component, the state funds on average 75%, with the locals picking up 25%, and the non-classroom share is 50-50. Those average percentages are adjusted based on each county's fiscal capacity or ability to raise local taxes for education.
This is Keith McDonald again. Let me just again reiterate, as we've looked at this, I understand what's supposed to happen, but when you look at what districts are having to fund, it's almost flipped the other way in some counties and some school systems where the locals are funding 50 to 70%. So again, the formula is based on something from about 1982 and supposed to have been adjusted in 2001, but I'm not sure all of those adjustments have been funded by the state at this point. But even with that, I mean, we are way behind in the BEP to make truly those numbers that you just quoted work for all school systems. Thank you.
Marianne, this is Dale Lynch with TOSS, and I also want to make sure that everyone knows, and I'm sure they do, and Marianne has educated many of us on the BEP over the years, which we're very thankful for. But there's almost 10,000 licensed employees across Tennessee who are picked up 100% by local districts. Is that right, Marianne?
I believe the number is somewhere in the vicinity of 7,000 or 8,000. But you are correct, Dale, in that the BEP does not generate every position that a school district has. All school districts have positions above those generated by the formula. And that is also considered part of the local match.
Okay.
And Marianne, I'd like to point out that in the non-classroom funding, in I think 2007, there was a floor for the classroom funding, so no school could go below 75% funding at the 50-50. No school system in the state would have to pick up more than 50% of funding. There was no formula, nothing done to the instructional salary component or the classroom funding component. And I don't know when we introduced this type of thing, but I would like to propose somewhere along the way that we put in a 50% floor in the instructional salary, instructional benefits, and in the classroom funding. I think there are only two systems right now that are in the position that are funding more than 50% locally of the funding. And right now, to make that adjustment, it would cost $13 million, but it would at least address part of the issue with the equity for all schools. Not adequacy by any means, but there needs to be something done to those two school districts that, due to their economy, and there may be others that will fall into this spiraling downward hole. I think we do need to address this, possibly by the teaching committee, to place a forward in the BEP that no school district in the state of Tennessee will be funding more than 50% of the BEP for their district.
And I'm going to apologize for the interruption. I believe that was Karen King speaking. Is that correct? Because you're speaking softly, and I'm struggling to hear you. So I want to make sure, but I also want to make sure that we have it for the record who was actually making that statement. So I apologize for that interruption.
I'm sorry. Karen King,
And Karen, you don't have to repeat yourself, I would imagine. I hope everybody else was able to hear you. There's just perhaps a little bit of a technical challenge at my end, but I wanted to make sure. I thought it was you, so I wanted to be sure for the record. The other thing that I want, or was there anything else you wanted to add to that, Karen?
yes, I did want to mention that this was pointed out, this issue, particular issue, was pointed out in the BEP task force 3 years ago. And it was recognized that there was an issue with this part of the formula. And for whatever reason, it has slipped by year after year. And I think that probably this might be the year that we need to make sure it's a small adjustment. It's a correcting adjustment as far as equity is concerned, an equitable distribution formula. No county or no school district needs to be funding more than 50% of the BEP for their instructional.
Nathan, do you have information regarding the results of the recommendations from this task force from 3 years ago that you can share with the whole committee? For definitely, I would like to have access to that so I can go back and review it.
2014 was when that was done. I know that reports were made to the committee at that time. I'm certainly happy to work with the department to get an official copy of the report that was done at that time. And I would also point out, Madam Chair, in terms of this discussion, and we're going to get to this when we get the next steps, but right. there will be discussion about the TASER memo from last year, but we're anticipating to do that in an in-person meeting later in the summer. And also a quick reminder that when we go about the process of adopting our top 5 priorities, that those priorities can be changes to the formula that aren't simply an emphasis on spending on one particular area or another, or the addition of something. You can also talk about the removal or the some change that's referred to here, and it would simply have to be among the top 5 vote getters in order for that to be listed in the priorities.
Nathan, I'm glad that you said that, because I had those thoughts in my mind as Karen was speaking, that would be an opportunity when we go through the survey process. But absolutely, when we meet in person, we want to take a deeper dive and have all of these appropriate discussions when we meet in person, and that might be perhaps in August, but we'll have to do a poll to find out what will work best for everyone else. So thank you, Karen, for bringing that up. Nathan, thank you for clarifying. And we'll move on and to see if there are any other questions or comments for Ms. Dursky. No other questions or comments. Thank you so much for taking us through that process, Ms. Dursky, and we know that you are the guru of the formula, and so I'm sure we'll continue to pick your brain and certainly make sure that we all clearly understand every element that we need to make informed and the right possible decisions. So moving on to the next item, which is the next steps that Nathan just mentioned, and I'm going to turn it over to him so he can take us through that process. Nathan? Nathan? Are you there?
Can you hear me now?
There's a lot of movement. I think when there's a lot of movement, it's cutting out your microphone. Let's try it now.
Okay, and I would ask all members to please mute their lines unless they're speaking. So thank you, ma'am. We will be doing our annual open survey of members to select priorities for the committee based on the top 4 or 5 responses across the way on that. And as we mentioned before, that doesn't just have to be what component ought to be added, but maybe what component ought to be taken away, or how formula ought to change. We will come back together to approve or modify that list and produce a letter of priorities for the governor, the commissioners of F&A and education, in time for our priority to be considered for the upcoming budget cycle. Also wanted to alert members that the House Education Committees referred 2 pieces of legislation to the committee to discuss. There's no apparatus in the rules of the House or the Senate for bills referred outside of the General Assembly to be acted on in a substantive way. In other words, we can simply have a discussion and those kinds of things, but that would lend itself to an in-person meeting. And those 2 bills are House Bill 255 by Representative Bob Freeman of Nashville regarding the inclusion of all teachers in the BEP formula, and House Bill 210 by Representative Tom Leatherwood of Shelby County concerning including pre-K funding in the BEP formula. I think that this will necessitate an in-person meeting, likely in August or September. And also at that time, I would think it would be good to take up the Tasser memo from last year at that point in time. Members will be informed of next steps and on all of those matters as the summer progresses.
Thank you, Nathan. Are there any other comments or questions from any of the members before we move into adjournment?
Madam Chairman, Keith McDonald again. Just on the scheduling, the sooner we can look at our calendars, and the better for many of us, including probably yourself. Yes. Our calendars fill up so far in advance. It would just be helpful if we get on that right away. Thank you.
I agree wholeheartedly with you on that point, and I know Nathan will take that up, and we will move as quickly as we possibly can. So thank you for making those comments. Any other comments? Without objection, we will stand adjourned. Thank you all so much for your participation today. Enjoy the rest of your day.